Every day, thousands of houses are sold in the United States for prices that seem like a typo. I'm not talking about empty lots in the middle of nowhere or shacks about to collapse. I'm talking about real houses with walls standing, intact roofs, and in some cases, ready for someone to move in tomorrow. The reason they cost so little doesn't show up in the flashy ads you see online. And it's exactly that reason that completely changes the way people see these opportunities. There are entire cities in the United States where buying a house costs less than buying a used car. There are regions where the local government is literally trying to convince people to move there. And there are cases where the problem was never the house itself, but rather a story behind it that few people stop to investigate. Throughout this video, we're going to go through 5 different places in the country where this is happening right now. Each one has a distinct reason for prices being so low, and understanding that difference can be what separates an excellent deal from a future headache. When we think about cheap real estate in the United States, the first image that comes to mind is usually a destroyed, abandoned house, somewhere isolated and with no appeal whatsoever. That idea makes sense, after all. It's rare to find something of value being sold at such a low price without an apparent reason. But the reality of this market is more complex, and also more interesting than it seems at first glance. There are properties advertised for prices that surprise anyone, some costing less than a used car in good condition. And the most curious detail isn't the price, it's the amount of time these houses stay on the market. Many remain for months, some even years, without anyone closing the purchase. That doesn't mean they're properties with no value at all, it just means there are barriers that keep most ordinary buyers away. These barriers can come in different forms. Sometimes they're legal rules that require specific care when renovating. In other cases, it's the location, a small town, a region that lost economic momentum, or a neighborhood that hasn't recovered its vitality yet. There are also situations tied to red tape, like unpaid taxes or legal proceedings that make the purchase more complicated than expected. What this scenario reveals is that a low price doesn't always mean an irreversible problem. Often, it just means most people don't have the patience, information, or strategy to deal with this type of property. And that's exactly where the opportunity lies, because those who understand these situations can see potential where others only see obstacles. The first type of property that tends to catch attention for its absurdly low price is historic homes sold for nearly symbolic amounts. At first glance, it seems like a perfect deal. An old building full of character with architectural details that would be impossible to reproduce today, being offered for a fraction of what a new house the same size would cost. Who wouldn't be tempted by an opportunity like that? The problem shows up when the buyer starts to understand what comes along with the low price. These properties usually carry an extensive list of legal requirements, created specifically to preserve the historic value of the building. That means any renovation has to follow very specific standards. You can't simply swap a window for a more modern one, or replace an old material with something cheaper and more practical. Each change may require approval from agencies responsible for historic preservation, and that process tends to be slow, detailed, and in many cases, expensive. That's exactly why most buyers give up along the way. The dream of owning a one-of-a-kind house runs into the reality of long timelines, unexpected costs, and red tape that few are willing to face. For those looking for practicality, this type of property gets ruled out quickly. But there's another side to this story. Those who have the patience, technical knowledge, or professional support to restore these properties correctly can turn an almost forgotten property into a true real estate gem. Well-restored historic homes tend to stand out in any neighborhood, attracting buyers willing to pay far more than the original value, precisely because of the rarity and charm this type of building carries. What seemed like a problem turns into a distinguishing feature, and what kept most people away can end up being the reason for success for those who had the vision to invest. The second type of cheap house worth knowing about is tied to a curious phenomenon happening in various regions of the United States: the population decline of small towns. Many of these places were once industrial hubs, agricultural centers, or working-class towns that experienced decades of prosperity. Over time, factories closed, companies moved away, and much of the population left in search of better opportunities in bigger cities. The result was a growing number of empty houses with no interested buyers and prices that kept dropping year after year. To try to reverse this scenario, some of these towns started offering properties at extremely low prices in an attempt to attract new residents. There are cases of houses costing less than the down payment on financing an apartment in a big city. For those who dream of owning a home without taking on a massive debt, this kind of offer seems almost too good to be true. What keeps most potential buyers away is exactly what caused these towns to empty out in the first place: lack of jobs, limited commerce, few healthcare and education services, and a daily routine very different from life in larger urban centers. For a lot of people, the low price doesn't make up for the lack of infrastructure and everyday opportunities. But there's a detail few people notice. Some of these towns, after years in this difficult situation, start receiving new investment. Tech companies looking for cheaper space, renewable energy projects, or even movements of people who decided to trade the fast pace of big cities for a quieter life in smaller places. When that movement happens, properties bought for next to nothing can see unexpected appreciation, surprising even real estate market experts. The third type of cheap house that deserves attention is the kind tied to tax lien auctions. This type of property almost always sparks curiosity because it involves a rather unusual situation. Houses that end up being sold well below market value simply because the previous owners stopped paying local taxes for an extended period. When that happens, the municipal government takes on the right to auction off the property to recover the amount owed. At first glance, it seems like the perfect opportunity for someone looking for a good deal. After all, it's possible to find houses in reasonably good neighborhoods being sold for much less than it would cost to buy a similar property through the traditional market. But there's a side to this story that few people know about before getting involved in this type of purchase. In many cases, the buyer doesn't just get the house, they also get additional financial responsibilities. There may be other debts tied to the property, like overdue HOA fees or outstanding utility bills. Also, depending on the US state, there's a legal waiting period before the new owner can get full possession, since the previous owner may have the right to try to reclaim the property by paying what's owed within a deadline set by law. It's exactly this complexity that keeps many investors away. The idea of buying something cheap and later finding out there are lengthy bureaucratic processes or hidden costs scares off a good number of people, especially those looking for a quick, hassle-free purchase. Still, those who study these rules carefully, understand each state's legal deadlines, and know how to check for outstanding debts before closing the deal, can find opportunities that rarely show up in the traditional real estate market. These are houses with real potential, but ones that require patience and technical knowledge to be put to good use. The fourth type of cheap house that tends to be underestimated involves so-called mobile homes. A lot of people grew up hearing that this type of housing is never a good investment, that it's just a temporary or low-quality option. However, that idea doesn't always match the current reality of the American real estate market. Some of these homes are sold at extremely low prices for very specific reasons. In many cases, they're located within residential parks that have their own rules for community living and maintenance, which keeps away buyers who prefer more freedom over their property. In other cases, the low price is explained by the home needing minor renovations, like an electrical update, flooring replacement, or simple structural repairs, but nothing requiring a huge investment. What a lot of people don't realize is that, in certain regions where the cost of housing keeps rising year after year, these homes have started attracting more and more interest. In cities where buying a conventional house has become practically unaffordable for middle-income families, a well-located mobile home with adequate space and in good condition has started to be seen as a smart alternative rather than a last resort. This movement has become even more evident among people looking to cut costs without giving up basic comfort, such as retirees, small families, or people who work remotely and don't need to be close to major urban centers. What once seemed like a worthless property has gradually been turning into a sought-after option, especially in areas where the dream of owning a conventional home has become increasingly out of reach for most American families' financial reality. The fifth and final type of cheap house worth knowing about is, perhaps, the most interesting of all, precisely because it goes unnoticed even by the most experienced investors. These are properties that have some factor considered inconvenient at first glance, such as the need for deeper structural renovations, a location that isn't valued yet today, or specific occupancy requirements like usage restrictions or simple paperwork issues to resolve. This type of property tends to be ignored precisely because it requires a closer look. While most buyers compete over move-in-ready houses in good locations with no outstanding issues, this group of properties remains forgotten, often listed for far less than it's actually worth, simply because nobody wants to deal with the extra work it requires at the start. The curious thing is that, over the years, several properties of this type ended up multiplying their value significantly. This happens when neighborhoods start developing, when new companies move into the area, when new urban infrastructure projects come up, or simply when demand for housing increases in areas that used to be overlooked. Those who bought this type of property, seeing the potential and not just the apparent problem, often reaped results far beyond expectations. And it's exactly this kind of hidden opportunity that makes a lot of people realize an important truth about the American real estate market. The cheapest property isn't always the worst deal. Sometimes, it's exactly the opposite. Behind an inviting price, there can be an opportunity that most people simply didn't have the patience, information, or vision to notice in time. After learning about these 5 situations, it becomes easier to understand why so many cheap houses remain forgotten in the United States. Most of the time, the problem isn't the house itself, but the lack of information on the part of those who pass it by without seeing what's really behind that inviting price. Historic preservation rules, towns in transition, tax debts, misunderstood mobile homes, and properties that require a bit more work up front, all of this keeps the average buyer away, but attracts exactly those who know how to look beyond the surface. The American real estate market has always made room for those willing to study before acting. While most people seek convenience and avoid any kind of complication, there's a smaller group of people who have learned to see value where others only see obstacles. And it's exactly these people who, over time, tend to reap the best results, whether by living in a one-of-a-kind house or by watching the value of a forgotten property multiply over the years. At the end of the day, a low price never tells the whole story. Behind every abandoned or overlooked property, there's a context. And understanding that context is what separates those who merely observe opportunities from those who truly know how to seize them. If this video helped you see the real estate market in a different light, leave a like. It helps the channel a lot to keep bringing you this kind of content. And if you want to follow more stories like this about properties, opportunities, and how the American market really works, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos.